Good morning, Friday morning on Rochester Today. I'm Andy Brownell, News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM. And once again, time flies by. It's already time to check in with the MedCityMovieGuy.com. It's Chris Miksanek. Good morning, Chris.
Chris, fading in. Thank you for the setup.
Roll.
We're rolling. Come up to speed. Sound check. So a lot of stuff coming out. A lot of stuff is out, and a couple things have been newsworthy. I'm going to start out with a film by Matt Walsh. If you don't know who Matt Walsh is,
I've heard of this.
Yeah, he's sort of, I would call him a conservative gadfly, which means, I don't think he's some rabid, right wing or anything, but he leans toward the conservative side. And like a lot of these people, the fuel for his argument is the other side's argument. And he does that brilliantly in this film called Am I Racist? I don't know how I would categorize this one, whether I would call it a documentary or just sort of an entertainment piece. I would say, whatever you think the film Borat was that a documentary? Was it entertainment? It happens to be a very entertaining documentary. I don't really know where I would draw the line, but in this one, he basically sets out to demonstrate the fraud involved or the hucksters involved in the sort of monetizing of the sort of racial grievance industry, I guess I'll call it. It happened to be, when it opened, the third highest grossing film at the time. And it expanded to 1,500 screens nationwide. That's pretty good. Like a major release would be 1,500 to say 2,000 screens. So that's a major release. That's not just a few, pandering to just a few people. So let me tell you why I think this one's interesting and why I wanted to lead off with it. I actually happen to have a dog in this fight, so to speak. Back when I was a community mediator in Olmsted County, for continuing education, CLE, I think credits, we call it. I went to one of these so-called privilege seminars. And one of the exercises there was, I think they call it the privilege walk. And everybody lines up and you have a little card that describes your character. And then they ask questions like, if you have two parents that are college educated, take one step forward. If you have this,
sure.
if you went to private
school. I've seen videos of this
right.
type of exercise.
Yeah, and I actually did it. The problem is that on the cards, they're all things like, well, I have two parents who went to college and, they can afford daycare. Those are the cards. None of the cards say things like, my father was a white coal miner who died at 41. You don't have that card. There's no, my father works as a drywaller, hopes for a lot of work this week because he has a kid going towards a useless degree, right? You don't have cards that represent real people. You have cards that represent what that side of the political spectrum thinks the other side looks like. And this is why this film really meshes well with something like when we talked about American Fiction, about that film, which was hysterical. It's basically addressing the same thing. So I had a problem with that. And the other problem I had with this class that I took, and these things are still going on, is that two of the first three things they said, if you have this, take a step forward because you have an advantage over people who don't. Two of the three things, one of them said, if you basically have two parents, all right? And then the other one was if you went to private school. So I'm thinking to myself, if these are known attributes of success, why is the left so against something like vouchers? Or they so want to vilify the nuclear family, and yet they use those two arguments as, well, this is why people are getting ahead, at least in the so-called privilege walk. So that kind of turned me off to that whole approach. So that's why when I see Matt Walsh channeling Borat this is an expression I've never used in my life, but to hoist the race hustlers on their own petard. Did you ever hear that expression? It kind of cracks me up. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But the other thing is, this one is as hysterical as it is revealing. There are several laugh-out-loud moments. I saw this film twice, if you could believe that, and it just came out. So it's definitely worth seeing. And the difference between this and something like Borat is that Borat was mocking sort of regular people. Remember, he went to a rodeo and made fun of those people and this kind of thing. Whereas Walsh is what they call punching up to the privileged ones.
Sure. I just read a column in Wall Street Journal just 2 days ago about this film. And one of the people featured in the film has accused Walsh of being a racist. And my understanding, according to this columnist, is this person is featured in the film because for, I think, a 2-hour talk, she charges $15,000.
I know. And that's what the point I think he's making here is the monetizing of this whole industry. And, what I think is incredible about this film is it is immensely balanced. And by balanced, I mean, he gives this industry, plenty of time to make their case. And it comes off as this word salad that would make Kamala Harris look like Albert Schweitzer. I mean, the word salads that they come up with are preposterous at some point. And you're right. He's paying people, one woman, because they'll flash like dollar signs on the screen. You know, oh, this person wasn't willing to talk till we paid the $50,000, and then they were willing to talk because one of them did charge 50, one was 15. The dinner, I think, the so-called race to dinner where only white women are allowed to attend, and then they get hectored for being, horrible racist. They pay $5,000 each, for example, for that privilege. So it's kind of interesting, and it's really, as I said, it's hard to see this any other way than what it is. It's just a race for dollars. After all of this, it's kind of funny because he puts on a little wig with a man bun and that kind of thing, which is kind of goofy, but I guess people recognize him, so he had to do something. But afterwards, after all of this, he pulls up to this biker bar, and he's got like a little e-bike, pulls up next to these big Harleys and things like that, and has a talk with these guys, telling them how he's going to address their, white supremacy and the systemic problems and this and that. And he's got this card that I don't know if he downloaded it from the internet or something that claims he's a DEI expert and this stuff. So there's a lot of things that go a little over the top, but I think that the essentials, just again, using their own words and their own voices to expose the hypocrisy of this race hustling, I guess is what I call it. And the other thing is the co-opting of our language. So again, I think that there's a lot of entertainment value. And of course, the big takeaway from this is there was one speaker in particular, and he talked her into paying reparations. Have you heard that part of the story?
No, I have not.
Yeah. So he's playing his character, saying how bad he feels, and he happens to have a person of color on his crew, and he says, I think I'm going to make a really bold statement here, and he pulls out some money from his pocket. He said, this is all I have. And, will you accept my reparations? And the guy's like, yeah, sure. I'll never say no to cash. Right. And then he goes to this woman who he's this author of a book. I won't give her any more exposure. She says she doesn't need it. But he says, well, what about you? Maybe is it something you want to do, is give reparations? And she's looking all confused. It's like, well, what do you? I think what we're really looking for is systemic, and we got to fix and Matt Walsh is like, look, I'm not waiting for the system to catch up. In other words, he's using their own words and their own concepts and saying that the rubber meets the road. This is our opportunity. So at one point, she has to get up. She goes to her purse and she gets a few bucks, and hands it over to the guy. And it's like a watershed moment, And of course, the fallout from that is, she claims she was tricked and all this sort of thing. But yeah, it's a hoot. Let me just say that. It's a hoot.
Like I said, when I saw that column, I had to put that on my list of films I want to see. And interesting, this columnist, who happens to be African American, cited in his column a Harvard study that essentially showed that all of this has had, especially in the workplace, no impact at all about people's views.
Mm. Yeah, I would argue.
In other words, it hasn't improved anything.
Yeah, I would argue maybe it even made people less likely to want to talk or interact with each other for fear of, and they approach this. Matt Walsh approaches this in a movie for fear of, I'm gonna report this to HR. So I think it's thrown up more barriers than it has built bridges. So that's interesting. And then he talks a little about the so-called race hate crime hoaxes, and of course a lot of these things that are alleged don't hold up to scrutiny. But then again, what the old adage is, the lie goes around the world 3 times while the truth is still trying to tie up the laces on their sneakers. So,
But yeah. I also don't want to minimize the impact of the real crimes that are bias motivated, that people even locally have had, vandalism and awful graffiti painted on homes and things like that. It does happen. It
does happen. No, and nobody, by the way, let's be clear about this. Nobody is saying it doesn't happen. But statistically, what one of the speakers is here, and he happens to be an African-American author, he says when you look at the 20 million crimes that occur every year, the 6,000 or so that are race-based, and a lot of them, by the way, are against Asian Americans, for example. That's one of the biggest unfortunate targets. You really start asking yourself, of course these crimes exist, and if you've been a victim of crime, and I have, maybe not race-based crime, but if you've been a victim, you certainly know that you don't care about the statistics, right? All you care about is my perception of how bad things are, right? So nobody's dismissing that, but we really it needs to be modulated, I think, and to say, these hoaxes have done nothing except perpetuate a narrative, maybe that the opposite effect, to say, well, there must be, a shortage of racism because they're making up race-based crimes. So, some people might argue that the hoaxes are doing more damage to the cause.
Sure. It makes people jaded.
Yeah, jaded, right? And skeptical. Yeah. And, and we've seen enough that Jesse Smollett comes up in the film and, that's not really helped the movement. As you said, I think, as I've said, I think it does more damage, to true victims because it makes it harder to believe.
We have to take a break, Chris. The hour is swimming by us, but we're talking with Chris Miksanek. He's the Med City movie guy. And we will return with more in just a moment on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96 Nobley. It's Rochester Today. Andy Brownell with Chris Miksanek, the Med City movie guy.com on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM. I have to ask you, because you're of the generation that I am as well, are you feeling any excitement about the new Beetlejuice film?
Right, so that's, perfect unprompted cue there. Yes, I am. Why, yes, I am. And it's kind of funny. Well, first of all, let me just say this. The great thing about films is they are so different. Films are so different from each other. Genres are so different from each other. Look, so we had this 8-minute thing where we ranted about, social commentary and a bunch of other stuff, and we're going to turn on a dime. I mean, that's how nimble we are, and we're going to talk about Beetlejuice, right? Isn't that great? Isn't that a great thing to be able to do? So the original Beetlejuice came out in 1988.
Wow.
Do the math, 36 years ago. And I think last time or the time before we talked about maybe we should have a segment about what we call sequels too late. Like, is it been too long to have a sequel? Should they, but so, and I said, well, let's wait to see what happens with Beetlejuice before we answer that question. So I wanted to zoom back to the original Beetlejuice in 1988. And if you haven't seen it or whatnot, the basic premise was that this family moves in and the house is sort of haunted. And, normally what you would do if you're like in Poltergeist, right? If your house was haunted, you'd hire somebody to get rid of the ghosts. Well, in this case, the ghosts are the ones who are bothered by the new non-ghost people that move in. So they're looking in the paper to find somebody who can basically exorcise the humans from the ghost house, right? And that's basically what the Michael Keaton character is there for. That was in 1988. And by the way, 1988 was a great year for film, at least as far as I'm concerned. Number one box office film in 1988 Rain Man. I mean,
Is that right? Wow.
That's one of the best films. If I had to make a list of 25 films, Rain Man would be on it. I think that hits on so many different points. Coming to America, this is Eddie Murphy at his peak, right? Coming to America. And Coming to America 2, by the way, which came out, I think, last year, is another example of, is that sequel, has it been too long, since then? So that's a reminder of that. One of my favorite Arnold Schwarzenegger film, Twins, came out in 1988. Twins was Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito. Danny DeVito, by the way, has a small cameo in the Beetlejuice sequel. I'll point that out. And of course, number 10 on the top 10 films was this one that we're talking about, Beetlejuice. It did $73 million in 1988. I don't have my calculator, but that was apparently a pretty lot of money.
And now it's that's quaint.
Yeah, that's quaint. Yeah. So the only ones that come back, Winona Ryder, who was the sort of brooding teenage girl in the first one, she comes back. Michael Keaton, of course, is back, and Catherine O'Hara is back. Now, we were going to maybe compare notes on the original.
Well, I'm just going to – funny discussion. This was only a few weeks ago, hanging out with some friends, and we started talking about the new Beetlejuice film coming out. Are you going to go see it? And the consensus was, especially from people our age who saw it when they were much younger, was this kind of looks like it could be fun. And one of the guys in the group looks at his wife and he says, "There's no way I'm going to go see that film." And we all looked at him and said, "Why wouldn't you want to go see the film?" And he goes, "I had nightmares for weeks after I saw the original."
Oh, wow.
And, of course, we laughed for at least 5 minutes because we couldn't imagine. It wasn't exactly a terrifying film. It was funny.
Yeah, it was. It was funny. It was my favorite character was somebody, and this is the brilliance of this character. All you saw of him in the first one, it was him sitting in a waiting room. Character's name was Bob. He was the guy with the shrunken head. Sure. And the expressions on that little head, on that face, were so brilliant that it's like, yeah, you're tempted to say they could make a whole movie about this guy, but maybe in small doses it works, in big doses it doesn't. Here's the thing, though, to me about these sequels. There's a fine line between there has to be enough connective tissue between the films and not so much that you're sort of slaved to the original premises and characters. So like if you were doing something like The Godfather 3, that's really your challenge, is to say, what is the connective tissue? Because I'm going to create a whole new plot line, right? Because I got 2.5 to 3 hours to fill. But I don't want to be so constrained by the original that this is just an extension of the original. These are just things that I think the writers and whatnot probably agonize over.
In particular in this case, because Winona Ryder, she may still be sullen, but she's no longer a teenager.
Right.
Not even close.
Right. So they bring in her daughter, who basically has that same persona, kind of dark and brooding, and they manage that, and I don't know, and they introduced another character which I thought was kind of fun, Willem Dafoe, who I just found out was born in Appleton, Wisconsin. So kudos to the Midwest people. Dafoe comes in. He's an actor who plays like sort of a film, sort of super cop, and he got killed doing one of his own stunts. And then he brings that sort of persona to the afterlife. So it's a funny concept of a thread. I don't want to give away a lot of spoilers, and I don't think that really is one of them. But that's kind of an example of, you introduce and maybe you build more of the universe, the underworld universe of characters. Sure. And then and so we see some of that. I got to say, the first half of this film, I was thinking to myself, I didn't care for it that much. And then there was this huge twist about halfway through, and I'm like, whoa, I did not see that coming, And I kind of looked over. My wife and I were screening it. I looked over and I said, well, I didn't see that coming. and it's at that point where the film goes up a notch, because you say, telling stories in 1988. Beetlejuice at the time, and Who Framed Roger Rabbit. This was a wild time in film for some things. And then today it's like, well, we got better effects and, I don't know, more sophisticated audiences. What are you going to do with this film? And when they took that leap, and again, I definitely don't want to give this as a spoiler. It was just like, whoa, that's all you could say. And then it went up a notch. So for that reason, I think people would enjoy it, especially if they're fans, because Michael Keaton does a great job. There's one point where he refers to himself as the Juice, which I thought was hysterical. The Juice.
Okay, so it remains on my list after your latest comments. Okay, we'll take a break for news. Chris Miksanek, the MedCityMovieGuy.com, is with us this morning. Rochester today on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 News app. Good morning. Welcome back. It's Rochester today, News Talk 1340, KROC AM, 96.9 FM. Friday morning with the Med City Movie Guy, ChrisMiksanek.com. No, I got that wrong. The MedCityMovieGuy.com, Chris Miksanek. You do not have a .com after your name.
I don't. Actually, well, technically there is a Miksanek.com and there'd be links there. But yeah, that's true. That's true. So you'll find me. Google works too. So we did a good amount of venting between the segments. The other movie, a couple more movies I want to talk about. One of them is on Netflix, just dropped recently. It's called The Union. I don't know if you've heard about this movie.
I saw it.
Oh, you did see it?
Yes.
All right. Well, why don't you tell me what you thought before I tell you what I thought. Let's do that.
On a fluff level, I enjoyed it. It could have been a lot better, I thought. The whole premise of the show was interesting, and they set it up in a way to be a franchise, obviously. I thought it was okay. How's that?
Right. So just for people who don't know the premise is that basically blue-collar workers are recruited into sort of a blue collar, thus just the title, The Union, blue collar spy network, I guess I'd call it, because these are the people who aren't afraid to do the work. I called it kind of a high body count for PG-13 when you think about it.
Yeah,
there was a lot of, and I don't have a problem with that. I mean, it's a John Wick, that's probably the highest body count. But, again, I just thought that was worth mentioning. The problem I had with it stars two people that are very bankable in film. Mark Wahlberg, one of my favorites, and Halle Berry. Two really solid leads. But somehow I didn't think the chemistry between them was really authentic. I didn't get the feel of that. That didn't distract me that much because the show is really about the action, even though you could call it a romantic comedy. And you're absolutely right. They definitely teed it up to be some kind of franchise the way they ended it, because, So it was fun. And it's the kind of thing you'd expect to see on, Netflix when you're skipping around and say, oh, hey, let me check this out. So I think for that reason, it's worth checking out.
Yeah, if you're bored on a rainy day,
you don't make it sound that bad if you're bored.
Well, I will say the guy who does the insurance commercials, and I apologize, the actor's name because he's everywhere.
Yeah, it's J.K. Simmons or something like that.
Yeah, I thought his role was pretty good, and the guessing game of who's the bad guy within the organization was entertaining as well.
Yeah, J.K. Simmons. Yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah, so he's been in a lot of stuff. I mean, a ton of stuff. And if you don't recognize the name, you will definitely recognize the face. So he's been in a million things.
But I will say this. You mentioned Mark Wahlberg as one of your favorites, and I share that. He has been in some incredible films. And maybe my expectations were too high because of that.
Yeah, because this is the kind of thing we say, boy, I wouldn't expect to see him in this. This is kind of a low-rent version of an action film, because he has been great in a lot of things. One of the things that percolates to the top of my list is a film called Three Kings, which was with Clooney. And,
yes.
It was one of the few films that kind of took place during the backdrop of the Iraq War, right? The Desert Storm. And that was a very, very good movie. And I think most of the things I've seen him in, I've really, really liked. So, yeah, this isn't up there on the list, but yeah, it's a solid watch, like you said. You know, if you're scrolling through it and you say, "Oh, hey, I heard somebody talking about that." Yeah, check it out.
Yeah.
You're
not going to hate it. Let's put it that way.
No, you're not going to hate it. You're not going to hate it. But I wouldn't set aside time and, put out a big spread on a table in front of me and sit down and get ready to watch it either. Two documentaries I want to talk about as a pair, kind of quickly. One is called In Restless Dreams, the music of Paul Simon.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I think Paul Simon's definitely ripe for a documentary. And then the other one, which is almost the flip side of the kind of music that Simon and Garfunkel did, it's called Nothing But a Good Time. And this is and you might have heard about this. This is the uncensored story of 80s hair metal. So it's kind of like, yeah. And it's better than it sounds, by the way. So let's talk about Paul Simon for a minute. I think Paul Simon, if you didn't grow up in the 70s, you might not have too much familiarity with what a musical factory this guy was. I mean, him and Garfunkel, and then him on his own. I think he probably had more success on his own. They were cranking out tunes left and right.
And there was music that was, for that time, it was the soundtrack of your life. I mean, you couldn't help, you ran into it no matter where you were at.
Yeah, exactly. And for years, I mean, Simon and Garfunkel had, when they had their reunion in Central Park, for example, it was like one of the biggest crowds anybody ever drew. I think the second, only up until Garth Brooks played, had anybody even had anywhere near that amount. And of course, Simon and Garfunkel, or Paul Simon anyway, was early on, I guess I'd call him an early adopter or whatever, early musical act for Saturday Night Live. So there's a little bit of an intersection between those two. Garfunkel was not involved in the documentary. Apparently, there was quite the fallout between the two. And I think Paul Simon always thought, why am I writing duets? Because he was right. I'm writing all the stuff anyway. I might as well just write it for myself. So it's an interesting path to see Paul Simon when he talks about those early days, because they don't tend to be tremendously positive views of it. At the breakup, Garfunkel wanted to get into acting, and Paul Simon was saying, well, what really did he offer to Simon and Garfunkel? So it was, as he called it, an uneven partnership. So that's something to remember. The other thing I wanted to point out about this is about the only song of theirs, actually probably my favorite song of theirs is, and a lot of people, if you ask what's your favorite Simon and
Sounds of Silence.
Oh, that wouldn't have been mine, but the one that a lot of people name is The Boxer.
That's another good one.
Yeah, that's probably my favorite. Sound of Silence is a good one too, because, again, this is the soundtrack for The Graduate. So, that was a big thing for them. But one of the things Paul Simon went on and did was he was one of the first people to do sort of this world music thing where he would go to different countries and kind of absorb the vibe. And there was some controversy there when he was working with South African artists during the apartheid thing. But I thought it was interesting, and I've always liked the song Mother and Child Reunion, and it wasn't until this documentary that I think I realized why, is he went and recorded that with some reggae artists, a band called Toots and the Maytals, who you don't have to know who that is, but it's one of my favorite reggae bands, and as we talked in the past, that's kind of a favorite genre for me. And if you go back and listen to Mother and Child Reunion, and you think about ska and reggae, you'll say, "Oh, I feel it. It's there." But you never knew it. But you never knew it before. So anyway, that's all about Paul Simon. So as I said, if you grew up, lived in the 70s, you were familiar with Paul Simon songs because there were a ton of them. The only thing I lament is that, if you grew up now, you're like, well, he's just another guy, like Bill Haley and the Cobbits. I don't know. You don't really know. You don't appreciate what this guy's contributions were.
But I will say this, their catalog is so much more immense than Bill Haley and the Cobbits ever.
Well, that might have been a bad example, but my point is the same, is that this guy's just relegated to the dust heap. If you don't know who he is, then I think that's the purpose of these documentaries, is to sort of, I don't like to overstate it, but to sort of immortalize certain things.
Oh, sure.
If you can, with the vibe. And that's sort of, I guess that sort of transitions us to talking about hair metal. And this is a 3-part series. I don't remember where it was. But anyway, it's called Nothing, and there's like two dots over the O. Nothing but a good time.
Oh, sure.
And
Motley Crue style.
Motley Crue style, exactly. And what they talk about, and again, this is sort of short-lived because I guess rock. Well, this is the documentary talking. Rock and roll was in a decline in the 70s as things like new wave and things like that and disco were on the rise. So out of those ashes, if you will, or the yin and yang of things, something rose, and they attribute Motley Crue as the beginning of the hair bands. And I think what they said was, this is the music, this is the quote, this is the music that's going to destroy Flock of Seagulls. But I think they credit the pinnacle of that era to something like Guns N' Roses. And the end of the era was probably Nirvana, where things went to a different genre, like a grunge thing. Right. So to me, it's kind of like the hair bands were like an extension of the glam rock, But and then they credit actually.
It's funny. I would have thought that Kiss would have gotten credit for it.
You think to end it? Because Kiss was probably,
I think Kiss predated Motley Crue, and I think that Motley Crue took so much from Kiss.
Well, they didn't credit Kiss. But,
okay.
But then again, Kiss is still around. See, so this is kind of the weird thing. It's like, if you look at like civilizations, you say the Mesopotamians. Well, you don't talk about the Romans because maybe the manifestation of them now is Italians. They're still around, but the Mesopotamians, they came and went, and so they're I don't know, they're documentary worthy. I don't know.
Everybody with a PhD in ancient civilizations is just moaning and rolling their eyes right now.
What? Because I talk about Mesopotamia?
You compared it to hair bands.
Oh, yeah. All right. Well, in a good way. In a good way. And then they talk about, believe this or not, and I didn't, but they talk about Beavis and Butthead having an influence on ending hair bands. I guess, they made fun of one of the characters they made fun of had like this Winger T-shirt, and it got to be, mocking those kind of bands. So they actually said that. They actually said
there was a lot to mock.
Yeah, well, that's true.
You didn't even mention Rat. Talking about hair bands.
So Rat they mentioned Rat. I didn't mention Rat. They mentioned Rat. And I think what's the significance of Rat? I think Milton Berle's son or nephew.
I think you're right.
Yeah, one of them was
Round and Round was their big hit.
Round and Round. And isn't there, that song is used in like a commercial.
A commercial,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was, we have a rat problem.
Rats in any attic or something. Yeah. That was awesome.
Which I thought was a brilliant commercial, by the way.
It is a brilliant commercial. It is. And that's going to do more to immortalize Rat than this documentary will, I'll tell you that.
My goodness, we have taken another break already. Chris Miksanek, the MidCityMovieGuy.com is with us today. Rochester Today. Back in a moment. News Talk 1340, KROC AM at 96.9 FM. Welcome back. Rochester Today, News Talk 1340, KROC AM, 96.9 FM. I wish we had a lot more time, but we're with Chris Miksanek, the MidCityMovieGuy.com. And, oh, goodness, Chris, we probably only have 6-7 minutes to chat more about movies.
Well, or movie-related people, and you reminded me that in the last several days we lost an icon of film, James Earl Jones, who many people will remember or know as the voice of Darth Vader in Star Wars. Yeah. And I think Star Wars and, of course, Return of the Jedi and what's the last one? The Empire Strikes Back. Return of the Jedi was the last one. So Star Wars in 77, Empire Strikes Back in 80, and Jedi was 83, I suppose. But he was also.
I'm not your father.
I am, isn't he? I am.
I'm your father.
I thought you said I
messed up the line. I did. I messed up the line.
You had one line to deliver. All right, we're going to do another take. He was in a film called The Exorcist 2, which actually I always thought wasn't too bad. It was not nearly as creepy as the first one, and some of the other ones that came afterwards were pretty bad. But he was the Kokumu in The Exorcist 2, and that was actually one of the better films. Not great, but one of the better ones. Of course, he was. We alluded to it earlier.
Wasn't he in Field of Dreams?
He wasn't Field of Dreams. That's right. He was like the writer, I guess, some kind of Terrence Mann was the character, the author, right? And he was in another film I think it's about the same time, and we mentioned it earlier, Coming to America. He played Eddie Murphy's father, right, the king, and we talked about that. Hunt for Red October, The Sandlot. He was the voice of Mufasa, right? So, yeah, you're not gonna get much better than that in film. What's the word I'm looking for? Film royalty, I suppose. That's pretty good.
His voice was just magical.
It was. I mean, he had, even in small roles, you knew it was just the articulation of the lines. I can't think of anybody with a more distinct voice than him. And if you were going to have somebody leave a message or, record a message for your answering machine, he'd be like tops, that would be awesome. He was great. He was great.
Think about all the kids in the 80s and into the 90s who had the fake Darth Vader masks that had the little box that would convert their voice into his voice.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, isn't it? Another event that I wanted to talk about, only because it segues into a documentary that I wasn't really going to talk about, but on this day, Chester A. Arthur is sworn in on the death of James Garfield. Okay, so why is that important? As it happens, it's not tremendously important. I mean, obviously it's important historically, but it's an interesting thing. There's a documentary out called The Vice Presidents or American Vice Presidents. I forget exactly what it was called. But anyway, one of the things it talks about is that the vice president role is traditionally, not a big deal. Right? Some people would even argue it was, a political death sentence. Okay. But, and this is the documentary talking, one out of five vice presidents have ascended to the presidency without being elected. So those are some pretty good odds,
Yeah. Heartbeat away from the presidency.
Yeah. But it's not just a cliche. It's actually happened. So, LBJ, came to be president without being elected president. Who was it? Gerald Ford got to be president without being elected president. We just talked about Chester Arthur. Yeah. So I think I don't know the exact number. Well, I mean, we could do the math. If 1 in 5, that's what, about 8 or 9 of them.
Gerald Ford.
I mentioned Gerald Ford, yeah.
Oh, you did, okay.
After Nixon stepped down. And then historically, and obviously when Lincoln was assassinated. So there's been several. And that kind of reframes the role of VP. Because as you say, heartbeat away, or some people will call him, as they did, I think, for, when Dan Quayle was vice president, impeachment insurance, right? Do you really want this guy? Maybe the president's not so bad after all, So I think that was kind of an interesting thing, in terms of that documentary. Anyway. And also on today, it's the first Cannes Film Festival was held today. Now, let me say something about the Cannes Festival. A lot of people think it's pronounced Cannes, like James Caan, and it's not. A lot of people think it's plural, like a six-pack has 6 cans. It's not. It actually is just pronounced Cannes, which sounds kind of like the wrong way to pronounce it. But that's how you pronounce it. And the first one was held in 1946. That's a big deal. I'll tell you what else happened today. And this is something you'll know about, and maybe you'll even remember. This is the day that Jim Croce died in a plane crash.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was. He was taken off somewhere in Louisiana in 1973, and
what
again,
a loss.
It was a loss because again, Jim Croce was like the Paul Simon of his day. I mean, he was cranking out hits left and right, and nobody who ever saw Jim Croce. And by the way, if you haven't seen him or haven't seen him lately, go on YouTube. They have a ton of live performances, and there's just something about there's a genuineness about Jim Croce that is really, that's the element we lost.
Okay. Your favorite Jim Croce song. I'll throw mine out right away. Operator.
Oh, Operator's a good one. I would say probably, Bad Leroy Brown.
I knew you were going to say that.
I was because it's the south side of Chicago. Yeah. But like I said, he does several songs, and he died so and also along the same lines, and it breaks my heart when I think about Harry Chapin. Same kind of thing. Harry Chapin died unfortunately in a car crash. His car then started on fire, and it was a terrible thing. And if you've ever seen him perform, I was able to see him perform once, but he has some live performances as well. And there's just something genuine and just really folksy about their performance.
They're storytellers.
They're storytellers. And there's a sort of intimacy, and maybe that comes from the content of the song. There's an intimacy about them that you wouldn't expect to see them like at the stadiums where the hair bands are playing. You would expect to see them in a small environment where they were speaking to you. So that's kind of neat.
All right, Chris Miksanek, the Mid-City movie guy. I'll have to get back to you after. I'm going to try to see Beetlejuice on the big screen.
Yeah, you should.
Okay. Well, I wish we had a ton more time, but we don't, so I look forward to our next chance to get together next month to talk more about movies.
We will.
Is the MedCityMovieGuide.com on Rochester Today.
Fade out.
There you go. News Talk 1340 KROC AM 96.